The Accidental President. Part 3, The Battle Within. Setting, the Presidential Villa, Abuja. The early morning light streamed through the thick curtains of the presidential villa's command center, casting a golden hue over the room. But the warmth of the sun did little to ease the tension that hung heavy in the air. Joshua Odum stood at the center of it all, his gaze fixed on the map of Abuja spread out before him. The battle had reached a crucial turning point, but the road ahead was still fraught with danger. Colonel Hassan, looking slightly more relaxed after the success of the previous night's mission, approached Joshua with the latest reports. "Mr. President, Bravo team has returned safely. The mission was a success, the enemy's artillery has been neutralized. We've also managed to secure our supply lines and bring in some reinforcements from the northern regions." Joshua nodded, a sense of cautious optimism beginning to settle over him. "Good. We've bought ourselves some time, but we need to make the most of it. Kalu won't take this lightly. We can expect a response, and it won't be long in coming." Lieutenant Adeora, who had been reviewing the communication logs, stepped forward. "We've intercepted some of Kalu's transmissions. He's furious about the loss of his artillery. He's issuing orders to intensify the siege and preparing his remaining forces for a decisive strike. He's also attempting to rally support from other factions within the military, trying to bolster his numbers." Joshua's eyes narrowed. Kalu's not just trying to win a battle, he's trying to consolidate his power across the entire country. If he succeeds in bringing more of the military under his control, it will make our position here much more precarious. Lieutenant Adeora nodded in agreement. "That's why we need to act now. We have to take the initiative, keep him off balance. If we allow him to regroup, he could bring the full weight of his forces down on us." Joshua considered their options carefully. The loss of Kalu's artillery was a significant blow, but it was far from the end of the conflict. If they were going to survive, they needed to exploit every advantage they had, no matter how small. "We need to reach out to the remaining loyalist forces within the military," Joshua said finally. "Kalu's grip on the military is not yet absolute. There are still those who remember what this country stands for, who haven't been corrupted by his promises of power. If we can bring them over to our side, we'll stand a much better chance of holding out against his forces." Colonel Hassan looked thoughtful. "There are several key figures who might be sympathetic to our cause. Some of them have been biding the time, waiting to see how things play out. If we can convince them that now is the time to act, we might be able to turn the tide in our favor." Lieutenant Adeora, always the strategist, added, "We'll need to be careful, though. Kalu will be watching for any signs of disloyalty within the ranks. If we make a move too soon or too openly, we risk exposing our allies before they're ready to act." Joshua nodded in agreement. "We'll need to approach this with caution. Start reaching out through our most trusted channels. Offer them a choice: stand with us and fight for Nigeria's future, or stand aside and watch as Kalu tears this country apart." The command center buzzed with renewed energy as orders were given and plans set in motion. But despite the progress they were making, Joshua couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something that could shift the balance of power in Kalu's favor if they weren't careful. Setting, Kalu's headquarters, outside Abuja. General Kalu was a man of many talents, but patience had never been one of them. As he paced the length of his command tent, his hands clenched into fists, the atmosphere crackled with barely restrained fury. The loss of his artillery had been a serious setback, and he could feel the pressure mounting with every passing hour. Kalu knew that he had to regain the upper hand, and fast. The longer this battle dragged on, the more likely it was that his enemies would rally against him. He could not afford to lose control, not now, not when he was so close to achieving everything he had worked for. Brigadier General Olatunji said cautiously, approaching with a report, "We've confirmed that Odum's forces are reaching out to other elements within the military. They're trying to rally support among the remaining loyalists." Kalu's eyes flashed with anger. "Traitors," he spat. "Every one of them." Olatunji continued, his voice measured. "We believe they're targeting several key figures, officers who have remained neutral so far. If Odum manages to sway them to his side, it could tip the balance." Kalu stopped pacing, his mind racing. He had anticipated that Odum might try something like this, but the speed with which he had moved was surprising. It was a bold play, one that could potentially undermine everything Kalu had built. Mobilize our intelligence units, Kalu ordered. I want surveillance on every officer who might be tempted to join Odum. If we find any signs of disloyalty, we move in immediately, no hesitation, no mercy. Olatunji nodded, already moving to carry out the order. But Kalu wasn't finished, and double the pressure on Abuja. I want the supply lines cut, the communications disrupted. We need to isolate them, make them feel the full weight of our forces. If we can break the spirit, the rest will follow. The general's mind was sharp, calculating the next moves in this deadly game of chess. He had underestimated Joshua Odum once, and it had cost him. He would not make the same mistake again. Odum was a capable leader, but he was still new to this level of command. He lacked the experience and ruthlessness that Kalu had honed over years of brutal warfare. But even as Kalu issued his commands, a seed of doubt began to take root. He had expected this conflict to be over by now, expected Odum to crumble under the pressure. The fact that the captain had not only held out but had struck back so effectively was troubling. Kalu knew that he needed to reassert his dominance, to remind everyone, friend and foe alike, who was truly in control. He needed a victory, something decisive that would quash any hope Odum's forces might have of winning. Prepare the airstrikes, Kalu said suddenly, his voice cold. If we can't break the defenses on the ground, we'll do it from the air. And I want full coordination with our ground units. Once the airstrikes have softened them up, we'll launch a full-scale assault on the city. Olatunji hesitated for a moment, recognizing the severity of the order. General, the civilian casualties. Kalu cut him off with a glare that could have frozen a river. I don't care about the civilians. This is war. The only thing that matters is victory. If we have to burn Abuja to the ground to achieve it, so be it. The order was given, and there was no turning back. Kalu's mind was set. He would win this battle, no matter the cost. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. Joshua Odum had just finished a strategy session with his top officers when Adaiora burst into the room, her face pale with urgency. Joshua, we've just intercepted a critical communication from Kalu's headquarters. He's planning airstrikes on the city. The words hit Joshua like a physical blow. Airstrikes. The implications were horrifying, not just for his forces, but for the hundreds of thousands of civilians still in the city. Kalu was willing to destroy everything, everyone, just to secure his victory. We need to get people to safety immediately, Joshua said, his voice tight with the urgency of the situation. Activate the emergency protocols. We need to get as many people as possible into the underground shelters and reinforced buildings. Colonel Hassan looked grim. Our anti-air defenses are limited, but we'll do what we can to shoot down as many of the planes as possible. Still, we're going to take heavy losses if those airstrikes hit us. Joshua clenched his fists, his mind racing. They had expected Kalu to escalate, but this was beyond even his worst predictions. Kalu was prepared to annihilate the city, to sacrifice everything and everyone in it, to break the resistance. We can't let this happen, Joshua said, his voice filled with resolve. We need to find a way to stop those airstrikes before they begin. Lieutenant Adaiora stepped forward, her expression determined. I have an idea, but it's risky. We could send a small team behind enemy lines to sabotage the airfields Kalu's using. If we can destroy the planes on the ground, we might be able to stop the airstrikes before they start. Joshua considered the plan. It was dangerous, almost suicidal, but it might be their only chance. If they could take out those planes, they could save countless lives and buy more time to fortify the defenses. Do it, Joshua said, his decision made. Assemble a team of our best operatives and brief them on the mission. We need to move fast, every second counts. Adaiora nodded, already moving to put the plan into action. Joshua watched her go, the weight of leadership pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had made the decision, but now it was up to the brave men and women who would carry it out. As the minutes ticked by, Joshua could feel the tension in the air, the anxiety of his people as they prepared for what could be the deadliest phase of the battle yet. The command center buzzed with activity as orders were relayed, preparations were made, and the city braced for the coming storm. Joshua remained at the center of it all, his mind focused on the dual tasks of defending Abuja and saving its people from the horrors that Kalu's airstrikes would unleash. As the final plans for the sabotage mission were being put in place, Joshua called a meeting with the officers who would oversee the city's defense in his absence. Among them were Colonel Hassan, who had been his steady right hand since the beginning, and Major Bassi, a tactical genius who had recently been promoted for her brilliance in urban warfare. "We're at a critical juncture," Joshua began, his voice calm but intense. "Kalu is throwing everything he has at us. If his airstrikes succeed, the damage will be catastrophic, not just to our forces, but to the civilian population. We need to do everything in our power to stop those planes before they leave the ground." Colonel Hassan nodded, his expression serious. "Our anti-aircraft defenses are positioned as best as we can manage, given the circumstances. We'll shoot down as many of them as possible, but we have to be realistic. If even a few of those bombers get through..." Joshua didn't need him to finish. The devastation would be immense. "That's why this sabotage mission is so important. We're sending a team to Kalu's main airfield. Their objective is to destroy the planes on the ground and sabotage the fuel supplies. If they succeed, we'll avert disaster. If they fail..." He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. "If they fail, then we're going to have to withstand the full force of those airstrikes." Major Bassi, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "We'll need to prepare for the worst-case scenario. If the sabotage team can't stop the airstrikes, we'll need to have contingency plans in place. I suggest reinforcing the most critical infrastructure, communication centers, medical facilities, and supply depots. We should also prepare for mass evacuations to underground shelters." Joshua appreciated her level-headedness. "Agreed. Begin those preparations immediately. Coordinate with local leaders to ensure civilians are moved to the safest locations. We need to minimize casualties as much as possible." As the meeting concluded, Joshua turned to Lieutenant Adeora, who was finalizing the details of the sabotage mission. The team had been chosen, and they were ready to depart. Among them were some of the most skilled operatives under his command, men and women who had proven themselves time and again in the face of overwhelming odds. "Are they ready?" Joshua asked, his voice filled with a mixture of hope and concern. "They're ready," Adeora confirmed. "They know what's at stake, and they're prepared to do whatever it takes to succeed. Lieutenant Adamu will lead the team. He's confident they can get the job done." Joshua nodded, feeling a surge of pride in his people. "I trust them, and I trust you, Adeora. You've been invaluable throughout this entire conflict. I don't know what I'd do without you." Adeora smiled faintly, a rare moment of warmth amid the chaos. "We're all doing our part, Joshua. And we're going to see this through, together." Joshua watched as the sabotage team prepared to depart. Each member was equipped with the tools and weapons they would need to complete the mission, their faces set in grim determination. The odds were against them, but they were driven by something more powerful than fear, something that Kalu could never understand. They were driven by a fierce love for the country, and a determination to protect it at any cost. As the team slipped out under the cover of darkness, Joshua felt a wave of anxiety wash over him. The success of this mission was critical. If they failed, the consequences would be devastating. But there was no turning back now. The die had been cast, and all they could do was hope that the courage and skill would be enough. Setting: a remote airfield outside Abuja. The airfield was a hive of activity as Kalu's forces prepared for the imminent airstrikes. Soldiers moved with purpose, loading bombs and fuel onto the planes that would soon rain destruction down on Abuja. The sky was dark, with only the occasional spotlight cutting through the blackness, illuminating the deadly preparations underway. Lieutenant Adamu and his team lay hidden in the shadows, watching the enemy's every move. They had reached the airfield undetected, thanks to the careful planning and knowledge of the terrain. But the hard part was still ahead of them. They needed to get close enough to the planes to plant their explosives, all without being detected by the heavily armed guards patrolling the area. Adamu signaled to his team, and they began to move silently through the underbrush, keeping low to the ground. Every step was measured, every movement calculated. They knew that one wrong move could mean disaster, not just for themselves, but for the entire city of Abuja. As they approached the perimeter of the airfield, Adamu took a moment to assess the situation. The planes were lined up on the tarmac, ready for takeoff. Fuel trucks were parked nearby, and the ground crews were busy preparing the bombers for the deadly mission. The area was heavily guarded, with sentries posted at regular intervals and patrols crisscrossing the perimeter. "We'll split into 2 teams," Adamu whispered to his men. "Team Alpha will take out the fuel trucks and any ground crew they encounter. Team Bravo will plant explosives on the planes. We need to move fast. Once the first explosion goes off, the whole place will be on high alert." The soldiers nodded, their expressions grim but determined. They knew the risks, but they were prepared to face them. They had no choice, failure was not an option. Adamu led Bravo team as they crept closer to the planes. The night was eerily quiet, the only sounds the distant hum of engines and the occasional murmur of voices. The tension was almost unbearable, but the soldiers kept the focus, the training and discipline guiding their every move. When they were close enough, Adamu signaled for his men to fan out. They moved quickly and quietly, planting explosives on the plane's fuselages and engines. Each soldier worked with practiced efficiency, knowing that time was of the essence. Meanwhile, Alpha Team moved toward the fuel trucks. They encountered several ground crew members along the way, dispatching them swiftly and silently. The fuel trucks were parked in a line, a potential chain reaction waiting to happen. Adamu glanced at his watch. They had just a few minutes before the planes were scheduled to take off. Everything had to go perfectly. He finished setting his charges and gave the signal for the team to fall back. As they retreated to a safe distance, Adamu took one last look at the planes. This was it, the moment of truth. He raised the detonator and took a deep breath. "Now," he whispered, pressing the button. The night erupted in a series of deafening explosions. The first blast tore through the fuel trucks, sending a massive fireball into the sky. The second and third explosions followed in quick succession, as the planes were ripped apart by the carefully placed charges. The shockwave from the blasts shook the ground, and the air was filled with the sound of twisting metal and the screams of panic from the enemy soldiers. The entire airfield was thrown into chaos. Kalu's forces scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The planes that had been meant to deliver death to Abuja were now nothing more than smoldering wreckage. "Move, move," Adamu shouted, leading his team in a full retreat. The element of surprise had worked in the favor, but they knew the enemy would soon be hot on the heels. The soldiers of Bravo and Alpha teams raced back through the underbrush, their hearts pounding with the adrenaline of the narrow escape. They could hear the shouts of the enemy soldiers behind them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't stop, not until they were safely away from the airfield and out of enemy territory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached their extraction point. A transport vehicle was waiting for them, hidden in a small grove of trees. The soldiers piled in, and the driver wasted no time in getting them away from the scene. As they sped away, Adamu allowed himself a moment of relief. They had done it. They had stopped the airstrikes, and in doing so, they had saved countless lives. But the cost had been high. Several of the team had been wounded in the firefight, and they had lost one soldier to enemy fire. As they drove through the darkness, the weight of their actions settled over them. The victory was significant, but it was bittersweet. They had struck a major blow against Kalu, but the war was far from over. There would be more battles to come, more sacrifices to be made. But for now, they had given Abuja a fighting chance. Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. The command center was a hive of activity as word of the sabotage mission's success spread. The mood was one of cautious optimism. Kalu's forces had been dealt a serious blow, and for the first time in days, it felt like they were gaining the upper hand. Joshua Odum stood at the center of it all, listening as the reports came in. The relief in his heart was almost overwhelming. Adamu and his team had succeeded, and the threat of the airstrikes had been neutralized. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. Kalu was a wounded animal now, more dangerous than ever. "They did it," Adaira said, her voice filled with both relief and resolve as she approached Joshua. "Adamu and his team succeeded in sabotaging the airfield. Kalu's airstrikes are off the table, at least for now." Joshua allowed himself a small, relieved smile, but he knew that this was only a temporary reprieve. That's one less threat to worry about, but Kalu isn't going to give up. If anything, this will make him more desperate, more unpredictable. Adaira nodded, sharing his concern. "We need to capitalize on this victory while we can. Kalu's forces will be disoriented after the loss of their air support. This might be our best chance to push them back, or at least to secure key positions in and around the city. Joshua turned his attention back to the map of Abuja, where the positions of both his own forces and Kalu's troops were marked. Despite the destruction of the airfield, Kalu's forces were still a formidable presence around the city. They had the numbers and resources to maintain a siege, and without air support, they would likely double down on the ground offensive. We need to strengthen our defenses around the key entry points to the city, Joshua said, pointing to several critical locations on the map. If Kalu is planning a ground assault, he'll target these areas first. We have to hold them, no matter what. And if we can, we should push out our lines to secure more territory. Every inch we gain makes it harder for Kalu to maintain the siege. Colonel Hassan stepped forward, his expression resolute. I'll see to it, Mr. President. Our forces are ready, and morale is higher after the success of the sabotage mission. If we're going to strike back, now's the time. Joshua nodded. Good. Begin preparations immediately. We'll need to coordinate closely with the remaining loyalist factions in the military. If they can launch simultaneous offensives in other parts of the country, it will stretch Kalu's forces thin and force him to fight on multiple fronts. Adaira added, I'll handle the communications with our allies. We need to ensure that they're ready to act the moment we move. This needs to be a coordinated effort if we're going to succeed. Joshua appreciated Adaira's decisiveness and trusted her implicitly. She had been his closest advisor throughout this entire ordeal, and her strategic mind had been invaluable in keeping the resistance alive. As she moved to carry out her tasks, Joshua felt a renewed sense of determination. But even as they planned the next moves, Joshua knew that the coming days would test them like never before. Kalu had shown time and again that he was willing to do whatever it took to win, regardless of the cost in lives or destruction. The man was driven by an insatiable hunger for power, and now that hunger had turned into a desperate need to crush the last remnants of resistance. Setting: Kalu's headquarters, outside Abuja. General Kalu sat in his command tent, seething with barely contained rage. The reports from the airfield were worse than he had expected. The sabotage team had not only destroyed his planes but had also inflicted significant casualties among his ground crews. The airstrikes that he had planned so meticulously, the strikes that were supposed to obliterate Odum's defenses and pave the way for his final victory, were now impossible. How did this happen? Kalu demanded, his voice low and dangerous as he glared at his commanders. How did a small team of saboteurs manage to slip past our defenses and wreak this kind of havoc? Brigadier General Olatunji, who had the unenviable task of delivering the bad news, stood at attention, his expression stoic. General, it appears they exploited a gap in our patrols. We believe they had detailed knowledge of our operations, possibly from intelligence gathered during the previous engagements. Kalu's fists clenched in fury. Odum is getting bolder. He's no longer just defending, he's actively undermining our operations. We underestimated him once, and now we're paying the price. Olatunji remained silent, knowing that any attempt to defend their actions would only anger Kalu further. Kalu forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. He knew that losing his temper would accomplish nothing. What he needed now was a plan, a way to regain the upper hand and crush Odum once and for all. We still have the numbers, Kalu said, his voice cold and calculating. And we still control the majority of the country. Odum may have won a small victory, but it changes nothing in the long run. We'll regroup, and we'll hit him where it hurts. He turned to his intelligence officer. I want detailed reports on Odum's movements, his supply lines, and his communications. If he's reaching out to other factions, I want to know who they are and what they're planning. We'll cut him off from his allies, isolate him, and then we'll crush him. Olatunji spoke up cautiously. General, with respect, we should also consider a new approach. The loss of the airfield has demoralized some of our troops. If we don't act quickly to restore the confidence, we could face desertions or even mutiny. Kalu's eyes narrowed. What do you suggest? We need a symbolic victory, Olatunji replied. Something that will rally our forces and send a clear message to Odum's supporters that resistance is futile. If we can capture one of his key commanders or take control of a vital position in Abuja, it would reinvigorate our troops and demoralize Odum's. Kalu considered the suggestion. It was true that a symbolic victory could turn the tide in his favor, especially if it was decisive enough to make Odum's forces question the chances of success. But it would require careful planning and execution. Any misstep could backfire and make things worse. Very well, Kalu said finally. Identify a target, and put together a plan. We need something that will send a message to everyone watching this conflict. Something that will show them that Odisa Kalu is still in control, and that nothing will stop me from claiming what's mine. Olatunji saluted. Yes, General, I'll begin preparations immediately. As his commanders moved to carry out his orders, Kalu sat back in his chair, his mind already several steps ahead. The loss of the airfield was a setback, but it was not the end. Odum was proving to be a more formidable opponent than he had expected, but that only made Kalu more determined to crush him. Kalu's thoughts turned to the civilians in Abuja, the innocents caught in the crossfire of this brutal struggle. They were pawns in his game, tools to be used to achieve his goals. If he had to use them to weaken Odum's resolve, he would do so without hesitation. The battle for Nigeria was far from over, and Kalu was prepared to do whatever it took to emerge victorious. No matter the cost, no matter the destruction, he would not be denied his destiny. Setting: the streets of Abuja. The streets of Abuja were eerily quiet as night fell, the once bustling capital now a shadow of its former self. The constant threat of violence had driven most civilians into hiding, and those who remained moved quickly and cautiously, wary of the danger that lurked around every corner. Joshua Odum walked the streets alongside a small contingent of his soldiers, inspecting the defensive positions that had been set up in anticipation of Kalu's next move. The success of the sabotage mission had given them a brief reprieve, but Joshua knew that it was only a matter of time before Kalu struck back. As they passed a group of civilians huddled in a makeshift shelter, Joshua paused, his heart heavy with the sight of the fear and desperation. These were the people he was fighting for, the ordinary men, women, and children who had been caught up in a conflict they had never asked for. They were the reason he couldn't afford to fail. How are they holding up? Joshua asked one of his soldiers, who had been overseeing the distribution of food and medical supplies. Better than expected, sir, the soldier replied. But they're scared. They know Kalu isn't going to back down, and they're worried about what comes next. Joshua nodded, understanding the fear all too well. Tell them that we're doing everything we can to protect them. We've made it this far, and we're not giving up now. The soldier saluted and returned to his duties, leaving Joshua to continue his patrol. As he walked, he couldn't help but think about the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He had never wanted to be a leader, but now that he was, he knew he couldn't let his people down. As they reached the edge of the city, where the outermost defenses had been reinforced, Joshua was met by Adeora, who had been coordinating the efforts to fortify the positions. Joshua, Adeora said, greeting him with a nod. We've reinforced the critical entry points, and our forces are on high alert. We're ready for whatever Kalu throws at us. Joshua appreciated her confidence, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change the course of the battle. Good work, Adeora, he said, his voice tinged with concern. But we need to be prepared for anything. Kalu's not going to sit back and let us recover. He'll come at us with everything he has, and we need to be ready. Adeora looked at him, sensing the weight of his thoughts. We'll be ready, Joshua. We've been through hell and back, but we've held our ground. And we'll keep holding it, no matter what Kalu throws at us. We're not just fighting for our survival, we're fighting for the future of this country. Joshua took a deep breath, letting Adeora's words bolster his resolve. She was right, they had come too far to back down now. The people of Nigeria were counting on them, and they couldn't afford to fail. As the night deepened, Joshua and Adeora returned to the command center. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone knew that Kalu's retaliation would come soon, it was just a matter of when and where. The calm before the storm felt like the city was holding its breath. Suddenly, a soldier burst into the room, his face pale with urgency. Sir, we've received reports of enemy movements on the outskirts of the city. It looks like they're preparing for a major assault. Joshua's heart sank. The time had come. How many? Joshua asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline surging through him. Several battalions, sir. They're advancing on multiple fronts, trying to stretch our defenses. We've also picked up chatter about a possible infiltration team targeting key infrastructure within the city. Joshua exchanged a glance with Adaira. This was it, the moment they had been preparing for. Sound the alarm, Joshua ordered. Get everyone to the battle stations. We need to hold the line at all costs. As the soldier rushed to carry out his orders, Joshua turned to Adaira. We need to stay one step ahead of them. Coordinate with our units in the field and make sure we're prepared for anything. And keep an eye on the civilian shelters. We can't let Kalu's infiltrators get to them. Adaira nodded, already moving to relay the orders. I'll handle it. We've got this, Joshua. We've faced worse odds before, and we've come out on top. Joshua appreciated her confidence, but he knew this battle would be different. Kalu was desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. He could feel the weight of the coming confrontation pressing down on him, but he pushed it aside. There was no time for doubt. The command center quickly became a flurry of activity as soldiers and officers moved to the positions. Alarms blared throughout the city, signaling the imminent attack. The tension was palpable, but there was also a sense of grim determination in the air. They knew what was at stake, and they were ready to fight for it. Joshua took a moment to look around the room, taking in the faces of the men and women who had become his closest allies. They had been through so much together, and now they were about to face the greatest challenge yet. But they were united in the purpose, and that gave him hope. He grabbed his gear and prepared to join the front lines. He had always led from the front, and he wasn't about to change that now. His presence on the battlefield would bolster his troops' morale, and he needed to see the situation for himself. As Joshua stepped out into the cool night air, he could see the first signs of the approaching enemy forces on the horizon. The distant rumble of tanks and the glow of headlights cut through the darkness, a grim reminder of the power Kalu still wielded. He took a deep breath and steeled himself for the battle ahead. This was it, the fight that would determine the fate of Abuja, and possibly the fate of Nigeria. Joshua knew that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting against a ruthless enemy. But they had something Kalu's forces didn't, a cause worth fighting for, and a leader who believed in them. As the enemy closed in, Joshua raised his voice, rallying his troops. This is our city. This is our home. We fight for our families, for our future, for everything that Kalu wants to take from us. We've held him off before, and we'll do it again. Stay strong, stay focused, and remember, together, we're unstoppable. His words were met with a roar of determination from his soldiers. They knew what was coming, but they were ready to face it head on. The first shots rang out, marking the beginning of the battle. The night exploded with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the shouts of men and women fighting for their lives. The ground shook as tanks and artillery exchanged fire, turning the once peaceful streets of Abuja into a war zone. Joshua moved through the chaos, coordinating his forces, offering encouragement, and fighting alongside his men. He could see that Kalu's forces were well coordinated, pressing their attack on multiple fronts, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer force. But his troops were holding the ground, refusing to give an inch. At one point, Joshua found himself caught in the middle of a fierce firefight, bullets whizzing past him as he took cover behind a crumbling wall. He could see the enemy advancing, trying to break through the defensive line. With grim determination, he returned fire, taking down several soldiers as they attempted to push forward. But the battle was far from over. As the night wore on, the fighting intensified, with both sides taking heavy casualties. The city's defenses were being tested to the limits, and Joshua knew that they couldn't hold out forever. They needed a breakthrough, something that would turn the tide in their favor. Then, over the radio, Joshua heard a report that sent a chill down his spine. This is Major Bassi. We've got infiltrators inside the city. They've breached the civilian shelter near the hospital, we're taking heavy fire, and we need reinforcements now. Joshua's heart pounded in his chest. The one thing they had feared the most, the possibility that Kalu's forces would target the civilians, was happening. He knew he couldn't let this happen. If the civilians were massacred, it would break the spirit of his troops and crush any hope of holding the city. I'm on my way, Joshua replied, his voice firm. Hold them off until I get there. We'll push them back. He turned to his nearest officers. We need to protect those civilians. I'm heading to the shelter. Major Bassi's forces are under attack, and they need reinforcements. Take over here and keep up the pressure on the front lines. Don't let Kalu break through." The officers saluted, understanding the gravity of the situation. Joshua didn't waste any more time. He sprinted toward the shelter, his mind focused on the task at hand. The streets were a chaotic mess of debris, burning vehicles, and the sounds of battle echoing through the night. But he pushed forward, determined to reach the shelter before it was too late. When he arrived, he found the scene as bad as he had feared. The shelter was under heavy assault, with Kalu's infiltrators engaging in brutal combat with the defenders. The area was littered with bodies, and the air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Joshua joined the fray without hesitation, his rifle barking as he took down several enemy soldiers. He fought with a fierce determination, knowing that every second counted. The infiltrators were well trained and well armed, but they hadn't counted on Joshua's intervention. His arrival bolstered the defenders, who rallied around him, pushing back against the attackers with renewed vigor. "Major Bassi," Joshua shouted over the din of battle. "We need to secure the perimeter and evacuate the civilians. We can't hold them off here much longer." Major Bassi, her uniform smeared with blood and dirt, fought her way to Joshua's side. "Agreed. We'll cover the evacuation, but we need to move fast. They've already breached the outer defenses. If we don't get those civilians out now, we'll lose them." Joshua nodded, his mind racing as he assessed the situation. "Get the civilians to the secondary shelter near the university. It's better fortified, and we've got more troops there. I'll cover you." Bassi didn't hesitate. She began organizing the evacuation, shouting orders to her troops and directing the civilians toward the escape route. The civilians, terrified but determined, moved as quickly as they could, trusting in the soldiers to protect them. Joshua and a small group of soldiers held the line, covering the retreat as the civilians made the way to safety. The firefight was intense, with Kalu's infiltrators pressing their attack, but Joshua's presence seemed to inspire his troops to fight with renewed ferocity. Slowly but surely, they began to push the enemy back. The evacuation was nearly complete when Joshua noticed a small group of enemy soldiers trying to flank them, heading toward the escaping civilians. Without hesitation, he charged forward, intercepting the attackers before they could reach the target. The battle was brutal, but Joshua's determination won out, and he managed to take down the last of the infiltrators. As the last civilians made it to safety, Joshua took a moment to catch his breath. His body was bruised and battered, and every muscle screamed with exhaustion. But he had done it, he had protected the civilians and pushed back the enemy assault. But the night was far from over. The battle still raged on, and Kalu's forces were relentless. Joshua knew that they couldn't hold out forever, but for now, they had survived another day. As he returned to the front lines, Joshua felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle for Abuja, and for Nigeria, wasn't just about territory or power. It was about the people, the lives that hung in the balance, and the future they were fighting to protect. With that thought in mind, Joshua Odum steeled himself for the rest of the fight. He knew that every second counted, every decision could mean the difference between life and death for his people. As he rejoined the battle at the front lines, the night sky was illuminated by the flashes of gunfire, explosions, and the glow of fires burning across the city. The chaos was overwhelming, but Joshua's resolve remained unshaken. The battle raged on, each moment a test of endurance and willpower. Kalu's forces pressed their attack, throwing everything they had into breaking the defenders' lines. But Joshua's troops, bolstered by his presence and leadership, fought with a tenacity that surprised even the enemy. They had been pushed to the brink, but they refused to give in. Joshua found himself in the thick of the fighting, moving from one hot spot to another, rallying his troops and coordinating the defense. He fought alongside them, his rifle never far from his hands, and his commands cutting through the noise and confusion like a knife. His soldiers responded to his leadership with renewed determination, standing firm against the relentless assault. As the hours dragged on, it became clear that Kalu's strategy was to wear them down through sheer attrition. The enemy kept coming, wave after wave, as if they were determined to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Joshua knew they couldn't hold out indefinitely. Supplies were dwindling, and his troops were exhausted. But he also knew they couldn't afford to lose this fight. At one point, Joshua received a report that a key defensive position near the western edge of the city was in danger of being overrun. If the enemy breached that line, it would allow them to pour into the heart of Abuja, threatening everything they had fought to protect. Without hesitation, Joshua gathered a small force of reinforcements and rushed to the scene. When they arrived, they found the situation even more dire than they had feared. The enemy had breached the outer defenses and were pressing forward, the numbers overwhelming the beleaguered defenders. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand in some places, with soldiers battling desperately to hold the line. Joshua didn't hesitate. He charged into the fray, his voice rising above the clamor of battle as he urged his troops to stand firm. His presence had an immediate effect. His soldiers rallied around him, fighting with renewed determination as they pushed back against the enemy assault. "Hold the line," Joshua shouted, his voice carrying over the din. "We can't let them break through. This is where we make our stand." His words were met with a chorus of shouts and cries as his soldiers fought with everything they had. Slowly, they began to push the enemy back, inch by inch, until the breach was sealed and the line was restored. The fighting was fierce, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of the wounded. But despite the chaos, Joshua's troops held the ground, refusing to give in. Joshua himself was in the thick of it, his rifle blazing as he took down enemy soldiers with deadly precision. He moved like a man possessed, his focus razor sharp, his mind clear of everything except the battle at hand. His leadership was an inspiration to his troops, who fought with a tenacity that surprised even the enemy. As the enemy assault began to falter, Joshua saw his chance. He ordered a counterattack, leading his troops in a fierce push that drove the enemy back and secured the defensive line. The enemy was caught off guard by the sudden shift in momentum, and they began to fall back in disarray. The tide of the battle was turning. Joshua's troops pressed their advantage, driving the enemy back further and further until they had regained control of the western edge of the city. The fighting was still intense, but it was clear that the enemy's morale was beginning to crack. They had thrown everything they had into breaking the defenders, and it hadn't been enough. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the sounds of battle began to die down. Kalu's forces were retreating, pulling back from the positions as they realized that the battle had turned against them. The defenders of Abuja had held the line, and for the moment, the city was safe. Joshua stood amidst the wreckage of the battlefield, his body aching from exhaustion and his mind reeling from the intensity of the fight. But as he looked around at his troops, exhausted, battered, but victorious, he felt a surge of pride and relief. They had done it. They had held off Kalu's forces and protected the city. But he knew this was just one battle in a long war. Kalu wouldn't give up easily, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for now, they had won a significant victory, and that was something to be celebrated. As Joshua and his troops regrouped, Colonel Hassan and Lieutenant Adeora approached, the faces reflecting the same mix of exhaustion and pride that Joshua felt. "Mr. President," Hassan said, saluting. "We've driven them back, but we've taken heavy casualties. We need to reinforce our positions and regroup." Joshua nodded, knowing Hassan was right. They couldn't afford to let the guard down. "See to it, Colonel. And make sure the wounded get the care they need. We've won this battle, but we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Adeora placed a hand on Joshua's shoulder, her voice filled with a quiet pride. "You did it, Joshua. You led us through the night, and we came out the other side. The people will remember this." Joshua allowed himself a small smile, though his thoughts were already turning to the next steps. "We did it together, Adeora. And we'll keep fighting together until we've reclaimed our country." As the sun rose over Abuja, casting its light on a city that had survived against the odds, Joshua Odum knew that the battle was far from over. But he also knew that they had the strength, the will, and the determination to see it through. The fight for Nigeria's future had only just begun, and Joshua was ready to lead his people through whatever challenges lay ahead. For freedom, for justice, for Nigeria. Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. Joshua Odum watched as the first rays of sunlight crept across the devastated cityscape of Abuja. The once beautiful capital was now a war-torn battleground, its streets littered with debris, and its buildings scarred by gunfire and explosions. The night had been long and brutal, but the sight of the rising sun brought a small measure of hope. They had survived the night, and with it, they had shown that Kalu's forces could be resisted. But Joshua knew that the dawn brought with it new challenges. The battle had taken a heavy toll on his forces, and they were running low on supplies. The defenders had fought valiantly, but the cost had been steep. Bodies lay where they had fallen, and the wounded were being tended to by medics who were stretched to the limits. Colonel Hassan approached, his face lined with exhaustion but still resolute. "Mr. President, the enemy has pulled back, but we don't know for how long. They're likely regrouping for another assault. We need to reinforce our defenses and tend to the wounded. We've suffered significant casualties." Joshua nodded, taking in the grim reality. "Get our remaining troops to secure the key positions. We need to hold what we've gained. And make sure the civilians are safe. We need to keep morale up. People need to know that we're still in control." Hassan saluted and began issuing orders to the remaining officers. The atmosphere in the command center was tense but determined. They had withstood Kalu's onslaught, but there was a sense of dread in the air. Everyone knew that this was just the beginning of a prolonged and bloody struggle. Adaira joined Joshua at the window, her gaze fixed on the city below. "We've won a small victory, but we're still surrounded. Kalu won't stop until he's crushed us completely. We need to think beyond just surviving each battle. We need a plan to break this siege and turn the tide." Joshua appreciated Adaira's strategic mind. She was always thinking several steps ahead, looking for ways to outmaneuver Kalu. But the challenge they faced was monumental. Kalu's forces still outnumbered them, and without outside support, the chances of breaking the siege seemed slim. "We need to reach out to our allies," Joshua said, his voice filled with determination. "We've held Abuja, but we can't do it alone. If we can get reinforcements from the loyalist factions in the military, we might be able to launch a counter-offensive. But we need to act quickly. Every day we wait, Kalu tightens his grip." Adaira nodded. "I'll start contacting our allies. We need to coordinate our efforts if we're going to make any headway. And I'll work on securing more supplies. Our stockpiles won't last much longer." Joshua turned back to the map, his mind racing as he considered their options. The situation was dire, but he couldn't afford to show doubt. His people were looking to him for leadership, for hope. And he had to be strong for them, even if the weight of it all felt overwhelming. "Tell our commanders to prepare for a coordinated strike," Joshua said, his voice firm. "If we can push Kalu's forces back and break the siege lines, we might be able to open a corridor to bring in reinforcements and supplies. It's a long shot, but it's our best chance." Adaira placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll make it happen, Joshua. We've come this far, and we're not giving up now." Joshua nodded, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. They were in a fight for their lives, for the future of Nigeria, and they couldn't afford to lose. As Adaira moved to carry out his orders, Joshua took a moment to collect his thoughts. The battle for Abuja was just one front in a much larger war, a war that would determine the fate of the entire nation. Setting: Kalu's headquarters, outside Abuja. General Kalu sat alone in his tent, a glass of whiskey in his hand as he stared at the maps spread out before him. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the previous night's defeat hanging heavily over him. Despite his meticulous planning, Joshua Odum had managed to hold the city, and the loss of so many of his troops gnawed at him. Kalu was not a man who accepted failure lightly. The setback had only fueled his determination to crush Odum and his forces, no matter the cost. But he knew that his position was becoming precarious. His troops were growing weary, and the longer the siege dragged on, the more likely it was that cracks would begin to form within his own ranks. "Sir," Brigadier General Olatunji said as he entered the tent, his expression grave. "The latest reports from the front lines. Our forces are regrouping, but we've taken heavy losses. Morale is low, and we're running low on supplies. The men are beginning to question our strategy." Kalu's eyes narrowed as he listened to the report. He had always known that maintaining control over his forces would require a delicate balance of fear and incentive, but the recent defeats had shaken that balance. "We cannot afford to show weakness," Kalu said, his voice cold. "The moment we do, Odum will exploit it. We need to reassert our dominance, remind our troops why they follow us." Olatunji hesitated before speaking. "Sir, with respect, we may need to reconsider our approach. The loss of the airfield and the failed assault on the city have taken a toll on our forces. We need to be strategic in our next moves, or we risk further demoralization." Kalu glared at Olatunji, his anger barely contained. You think I don't know that? You think I don't understand the stakes here? I've come too far to let some upstart captain take it all away from me. We need to crush Odum, and we need to do it now. Olatunji knew better than to argue further. What are your orders, General? Kalu took a deep breath, his mind racing with possibilities. He needed a decisive victory, something that would break Odum's spirit and rally his own forces. But he also needed to be smart. Another failed assault would only weaken his position further. We'll launch a coordinated attack on multiple fronts, Kalu said finally. We'll hit them where they least expect it, use diversionary tactics to draw the forces away from the key points, then strike hard. I want this done with precision and ruthlessness. No more mistakes. Olatunji nodded. And the men? Kalu's gaze hardened. Remind them what's at stake. Those who serve me loyally will be rewarded beyond the wildest dreams. Those who waver will face the consequences. As Olatunji left to relay the orders, Kalu downed the rest of his whiskey in one gulp, the liquid burning his throat. He couldn't afford to lose control now. The battle for Nigeria was a high-stakes game, and he intended to win, no matter the cost. Kalu's thoughts drifted back to the civilians in Abuja, the innocents caught in the crossfire. They were pawns in his game, expendable in his pursuit of power. If he had to use them to break Odum's resolve, so be it. The people will learn to fear me, Kalu muttered to himself. And when they do, they'll know that there is no escape from Odisa Kalu. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. Back at the presidential villa, Joshua and his commanders were preparing for the next phase of the defense. They had managed to hold off Kalu's forces, but they knew that the enemy would be back with renewed ferocity. The city was battered, but its defenders were still standing, and they were ready to fight for every inch of ground. Adeora had just finished communicating with their allies, and she returned to the command center with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. We've received word from several loyalist factions. They're mobilizing the forces and preparing to move on Kalu's positions from the north. If we can coordinate our efforts, we might be able to trap Kalu's forces in a pincer movement. Joshua felt a surge of relief. The prospect of reinforcements and a coordinated counterattack was exactly what they needed. That's good news. We'll need to time our attack perfectly, hit Kalu's forces while they're stretched thin and vulnerable. Colonel Hassan joined the conversation, his expression thoughtful. We'll need to gather intelligence on Kalu's movements. If we can anticipate where he's going to strike next, we can plan our counterattack accordingly. Joshua agreed. We'll need our scouts and intelligence teams working overtime. We can't afford to be caught off guard. As they planned the next moves, Joshua couldn't help but feel the weight of the coming battle. This was more than just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future of Nigeria. The decisions they made in the coming days would determine the course of the entire conflict. But for now, they had a chance to push back against Kalu's tyranny, to reclaim the country from the clutches of a dictator. It was a slim chance, but it was enough to give Joshua and his people hope. The battle for Abuja had tested them like never before, but they had emerged stronger for it. And now, with reinforcements on the way and a plan to break the siege, they were ready to take the fight to Kalu. The atmosphere in the command center, though tense, was charged with a newfound sense of purpose. They were no longer just defending, they were preparing to strike back. Setting, the outskirts of Abuja. As night fell once again, the outskirts of Abuja became a hive of activity. The loyalist forces, responding to Joshua Odum's call for reinforcements, were assembling in the northern territories, preparing for a coordinated assault on Kalu's besieging army. These were men and women who had once served under the same banner as Kalu but had chosen to stand against his tyranny, rallying to Odum's cause in the hope of restoring Nigeria to its rightful state. Major Chima, a seasoned commander known for his tactical brilliance, had taken charge of the northern forces. He had served with Joshua in the past and knew firsthand the kind of leader he was. As his troops gathered in the cover of darkness, Chima reviewed the latest intelligence reports, his mind already calculating the best approach for the upcoming battle. We need to hit them hard and fast, Chima said to his officers, pointing to the positions on the map where Kalu's forces were most vulnerable. Kalu will expect a conventional assault, but we're going to surprise him. We'll attack from the flanks, cutting off the supply lines and forcing them to fight on multiple fronts. If we can weaken the perimeter, Odum's forces in Abuja can break through and join us in a decisive push." His officers nodded in agreement, recognizing the brilliance of the plan. They knew that time was of the essence. If they could strike before Kalu had a chance to regroup, they might be able to turn the tide of the entire conflict. "Prepare the men," Chima ordered. "We move at first light." Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. Back in the presidential villa, Joshua was in constant communication with Major Chima, coordinating the timing of their attacks. The two commanders shared a mutual respect, and the strategies were aligning perfectly. They knew that the success of this operation depended on flawless execution and timing. "We'll start our offensive just before dawn," Joshua said over the secure line. "Our forces will hit Kalu's positions from within the city at the same time you strike from the north. With any luck, we'll catch them between us and cut off the retreat." Chima's voice crackled through the radio. "Understood. We'll be ready. May the gods of our ancestors be with us." Joshua smiled at the old saying, a nod to the deep cultural roots that connected them all. "And with you, Chima. Let's bring an end to this madness." As he ended the call, Adara approached with the final readiness report. "Our forces are in position. Morale is high, and they're eager to take the fight to Kalu. The civilians have been moved to safer areas, and our medics are prepared for the casualties we might take." Joshua nodded, satisfied with the preparations. "It's all or nothing, Adara. We've held them off this long, but we need to end this siege before it grinds us down completely." Adara looked at him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "And we will, Joshua. We've come too far to stop now." Joshua gave her a small, reassuring smile, then turned to face the map that had been the center of his focus for so long. This was it, the moment that could define the future of Nigeria. Setting: Kalu's headquarters, outside Abuja. General Kalu was growing increasingly frustrated. His forces had regrouped after the failed assault on Abuja, but the setback had shaken his confidence. Reports of loyalist movements in the north had reached him, and he knew that a coordinated attack was imminent. Yet, his forces were stretched thin, the morale wavering after the recent defeats. Kalu paced his command tent, his mind racing with strategies and countermeasures. He knew he needed to anticipate Odum's next move, to outthink and outmaneuver him. But with every passing hour, it became clearer that the tide was turning against him. Brigadier General Olatunji said as he entered the tent, "We've received intelligence that Odum's forces are preparing for an offensive. They're planning to hit us from within the city while the loyalists strike from the north." Kalu's jaw clenched as he absorbed the information. He had expected Odum to try something bold, but this was a calculated risk, one that could potentially unravel all of Kalu's plans if it succeeded. "We'll need to divide our forces," Kalu said, his voice tense. "Pull back some of our troops to reinforce our northern perimeter, and double our patrols around the city. If Odum tries to break through, we'll be ready for him." Olatunji hesitated. "General, dividing our forces could weaken our position. If Odum's forces break through, we might not have enough strength to push them back." Kalu shot him a withering glare. "I don't need you to tell me what's at stake, Olatunji. I know exactly what we're dealing with. But we have no choice. We can't afford to let Odum link up with the loyalists. If we don't stop him now, we'll lose everything." Olatunji nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. He left to carry out the orders, leaving Kalu alone with his thoughts. Kalu knew that the coming battle would be the most important of his life. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed, was on the line. He couldn't afford to lose, not now, not when he was so close to achieving his ultimate goal. But the growing strength of Odum's forces and the resilience of the people of Abuja had rattled him. His usual confidence was wavering. As he stared at the map, Kalu knew that he needed to remind his troops, and himself, why they were fighting. He needed a victory, something decisive that would crush Odum's spirit and rally his own forces. But deep down, he knew that this battle would not be easy. The momentum had shifted, and he was facing an opponent who had proven far more formidable than he had anticipated. "The people will remember this day," Kalu muttered to himself. "They will remember who holds the power in Nigeria. And they will bow to me, or they will be destroyed." Setting: the battlefield, Abuja. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the city of Abuja braced for what could be the final battle of the siege. Joshua Odum stood at the front lines, his heart pounding in his chest as he surveyed his troops. They were tired, the bodies battered from days of fighting, but the spirits were unbroken. They knew what was at stake, and they were ready to fight for the city, for the country. Joshua raised his voice, addressing the men and women who had fought so bravely under his command. This is our moment. Today, we take back our city. We've held the line, and now we're going to drive them out of Abuja once and for all. Fight with everything you have, for your families, for your future, for Nigeria. His words were met with a resounding cheer, a roar of determination that echoed through the streets. The soldiers took up the positions, weapons ready, eyes focused on the enemy lines. They knew the battle ahead would be brutal, but they were prepared to give their all. The signal came, and the coordinated attack began. From the north, Major Chima's forces struck first, hitting Kalu's perimeter with a ferocity that took the enemy by surprise. The loyalists moved with precision, cutting through the enemy lines and targeting key positions to disrupt Kalu's command structure. The northern forces fought with a passion born of loyalty to the country, their attacks driving deep into Kalu's defenses. Within the city, Joshua's forces launched their own assault, moving swiftly through the streets to hit Kalu's troops from within. The battle was chaotic, with gunfire, explosions, and the clash of metal filling the air. But Joshua's strategy was clear: overwhelm the enemy from multiple directions, break the lines, and push them out of the city. Joshua himself was in the thick of the fighting, leading his men with courage and determination. He fought alongside them, his presence inspiring his troops to press forward even as the enemy resistance stiffened. Every step they took was hard-won, but they were making progress, inch by inch, pushing Kalu's forces back. The battle raged on, each moment a test of endurance and resolve. Kalu's troops fought with the desperation of men who knew they were losing, but Joshua's forces had the upper hand. The enemy's lines were beginning to buckle under the relentless pressure, and it was clear that Kalu's strategy was unraveling. As the day wore on, the combined forces of Joshua and Chima's loyalists managed to break through Kalu's defenses, linking up in a pincer movement that trapped Kalu's troops between them. The enemy was surrounded, cut off from the supply lines, and with no clear path of retreat. Realizing that the battle was lost, many of Kalu's soldiers began to surrender, laying down their arms as the reality of the situation set in. But not all were willing to give up. Pockets of resistance continued to fight, desperate to hold on to what little ground they had left. Joshua pushed forward, leading the final assault on Kalu's remaining forces. The fighting was fierce, but the outcome was inevitable. One by one, the enemy positions fell, until there was nothing left of Kalu's once formidable army but scattered remnants and defeated soldiers. As the last of Kalu's forces were subdued, the battlefield fell into an uneasy silence. The dust began to settle, revealing the full extent of the devastation that had been wrought over the course of the day. Bodies of the fallen lay strewn across the streets, both friend and foe, a stark reminder of the cost of this hard-fought victory. Joshua Odum stood amidst the ruins, his uniform stained with dirt and blood, his body aching from the strain of battle. But there was no time to rest, there were still survivors to attend to, and the city needed to be secured. He could see the exhaustion etched into the faces of his soldiers, but there was also a glimmer of hope in their eyes. They had done it. Against all odds, they had broken the siege and driven Kalu's forces out of Abuja. Begin rounding up the prisoners, Joshua ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting over the noise of battle. Treat the wounded, ours and theirs. We're not butchers. We'll show them that we're better than Kalu's regime. Colonel Hassan approached, his own exhaustion evident but tempered by a sense of pride. Mr. President, we've secured the city. The last pockets of resistance are being dealt with as we speak. Kalu's forces are in full retreat. Joshua nodded, relief washing over him. And Major Chima's forces. They've taken control of the northern perimeter and are moving in to assist with the cleanup operations. We've established full control of the city and surrounding areas. The siege is broken. A wave of cheers rose up from the soldiers around them as the news spread. The sound was both jubilant and tinged with sorrow for the lives lost. This victory, though hard won, had come at a great cost. But it was a victory nonetheless, and one that marked a turning point in the struggle. As Joshua surveyed the scene, he spotted Adaora making her way through the rubble toward him. Her face was streaked with dirt, but her eyes were bright with determination. She had been in the thick of it as well, coordinating the various fronts and ensuring the success of the operation. "We did it, Joshua," she said as she reached him, her voice full of emotion. "The city is ours." Joshua allowed himself a small, tired smile. "We did it together, Adeora. But this is just the beginning. We've won the battle, but the war isn't over yet." Adeora nodded, understanding the weight of his words. "Kalu's still out there, and he won't take this defeat lying down. We need to press our advantage, keep the momentum going. If we can rally the rest of the country, we can end this once and for all." Joshua knew she was right. The victory in Abuja was a significant one, but it was far from the final part in the struggle. Kalu still held power in other regions, and his influence was not easily eradicated. They had to act swiftly, leveraging this victory to rally more support and weaken Kalu's hold on the country. "Start reaching out to our allies," Joshua said, his mind already turning to the next steps. "We need to consolidate our gains, rebuild our forces, and prepare for the next phase. This isn't just about taking back territory, it's about reclaiming Nigeria's soul." Adeora squeezed his shoulder, a gesture of both support and shared determination. "I'll start the communications immediately. We've shown the people that Kalu can be beaten. Now we need to give them a reason to stand with us." Joshua watched as she walked away, her words echoing in his mind. They had indeed shown that Kalu's regime could be challenged, that it was not invincible. But now they had to transform that victory into something more, something lasting. He turned his attention back to the soldiers, who were already beginning the grim task of clearing the battlefield and tending to the wounded. Joshua joined them, moving from one group to the next, offering words of encouragement and lending a hand where he could. He knew that his presence was important, that his men needed to see that he was with them, that he shared in the struggles. As the day turned into night, the city of Abuja slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The streets, though still scarred by the battle, were no longer filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Instead, there was the steady hum of activity as the survivors began to pick up the pieces and rebuild. Joshua found himself standing on a rooftop, overlooking the city that he had fought so hard to defend. The skyline was a mix of shattered buildings and intact structures, a visual representation of the battle that had just taken place. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and dust, but it was also filled with something else, hope. "We've taken back our city," Joshua whispered to himself. "Now we need to take back our country." Setting, a remote location, Nigeria. General Kalu sat in a dimly lit room, his hands trembling slightly as he read the reports of the day's defeat. His forces had been routed, his siege broken, and the city of Abuja had slipped through his fingers. The news was a crushing blow, one that left him feeling more vulnerable than ever. For the first time since his rise to power, Kalu felt the cold grip of fear. Joshua Odum had proven himself a formidable opponent, one who had managed to do what many thought impossible: unite the fractured remnants of the military and the people against Kalu's regime. And now, with the victory in Abuja, Odum had gained a powerful momentum that threatened to sweep across the entire country. Kalu knew that his position was precarious. His forces were demoralized, his allies growing wary. The defeat in Abuja had sent shockwaves through his ranks, and the loyalty he had once commanded was beginning to waver. He clenched his fists, his mind racing as he considered his next move. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. He needed to regroup, to find a way to regain the upper hand before Odum's forces could capitalize on the victory. "We're not done yet," Kalu muttered to himself, his voice laced with a mixture of desperation and determination. Odum may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. He knew that he needed to strike back, to remind his enemies, and his allies, why they feared him. But how? His resources were dwindling, and his options were limited. Yet, he refused to believe that he had been beaten. There had to be a way to turn the tide, to reclaim his position of power. Kalu's mind began to formulate a plan, one that would involve taking drastic measures to regain control. It was risky, and it would require sacrifices, but it was the only way. He needed to act quickly, to catch Odum off guard before he could consolidate his gains. As Kalu sat in the darkness, plotting his next move, he knew that the coming days would be critical. The battle for Nigeria was entering a new phase, one that would determine the fate of the entire nation. And in this phase, there would be no room for error. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. In the days that followed the battle, the city of Abuja began the slow process of healing. The streets were cleared, the wounded were cared for, and the dead were honored. The people, though weary from the conflict, found strength in the victory they had achieved. It was a small victory, but it was a beacon of hope in a dark time. Joshua Odum stood in the newly fortified command center, surrounded by his advisors and military leaders. The mood was one of cautious optimism. They had won an important battle, but they all knew that the war was far from over. Adeora had been in constant communication with their allies, coordinating efforts to rally more support and prepare for the next phase of the campaign. The response had been encouraging, more factions were joining the cause, and supplies were beginning to flow into the city once again. "Mr. President," Adeora said as she approached, holding a report in her hand. "Our allies are mobilizing. We've secured key supply lines, and reinforcements are on the way. It looks like the tide is finally turning in our favor." Joshua took the report, glancing over it with a nod of approval. "This is good news. We've made a significant step forward, but we can't afford to become complacent. Kalu is still out there, and he'll be looking for any opportunity to strike back." Adeora agreed. "We need to keep the pressure on him. If we can maintain our momentum, we might be able to force Kalu into a corner where he has no choice but to surrender." Joshua appreciated her optimism, but he knew that Kalu was not the type to surrender easily. The general was ruthless and cunning, and he would not go down without a fight. Still, the fact that they were even discussing the possibility of Kalu's surrender was a testament to how far they had come. "We'll continue to build our alliances and strengthen our positions," Joshua said, his voice filled with resolve. "But we must be ready for anything. Kalu will not go quietly. We need to be prepared for the final push, whatever form it takes." Adeora placed a hand on his arm, her expression serious. "We're with you, Joshua. We've followed you this far, and we'll see this through to the end." Joshua looked around at the faces of those who had stood by him throughout this ordeal. They had faced incredible odds, but they had never lost faith. They had believed in him, even when he had doubted himself. And now, standing on the brink of what could be the final phase of the struggle, Joshua felt a deep sense of responsibility to see it through. He couldn't afford to fail, not for himself, but for the people who had placed the trust in him, for the nation that desperately needed to be freed from Kalu's tyranny. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "We'll see this through," Joshua said, his voice resolute. "We've come too far to turn back now. Nigeria's future depends on us." Setting: Kalu's hideout, Nigeria. General Kalu sat at a small table in a dimly lit room, surrounded by the remnants of his once loyal advisors. The atmosphere was thick with tension and fear of what Kalu might do next, fear of the uncertain future they all faced. Kalu's gaze was cold and distant, his mind racing as he tried to devise a way to reclaim control. His forces were in disarray, and his once unquestionable grip on the military was slipping through his fingers. The victory in Abuja had emboldened his enemies, and the walls were closing in on him. "General," one of his advisors ventured cautiously, "we've received reports that Odum's forces are gaining support across the country. If we don't act quickly, we could lose our strongholds in the south as well." Kalu's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm well aware of the situation. But we're not beaten yet. Odum may have won a battle, but the war is far from over." The advisor hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, with respect, we need to regroup. We need to consolidate our remaining forces, perhaps even negotiate a ceasefire to buy us time." The suggestion of a ceasefire sent a wave of anger through Kalu. He had never been one to back down, and the idea of negotiating with Odum, of appearing weak in the eyes of his enemies, was intolerable. "Negotiate?" Kalu spat, his voice filled with venom. "Do you think Odum will show us mercy? Do you think he'll let us walk away after what we've done? No. The only way to survive this is to crush him, to break his spirit and make him realize that he can't win." "But General," another advisor interjected, "we've lost much of our support. The people are turning against us. If we continue down this path." Kalu slammed his fist on the table, silencing the room. "Enough. I will not be lectured on strategy by cowards who are too afraid to fight. Odum is weak, and I will show him, and the rest of this country, that I am still in control." He stood up, his presence commanding the room. "We'll strike at his heart. We'll take back what he's stolen from us, and we'll remind everyone who the true ruler of Nigeria is." The room fell silent, the advisors exchanging nervous glances. They knew better than to argue with Kalu when he was in this state. His ruthlessness was legendary, and they had no doubt that he would follow through on his threats. "We'll gather our remaining forces," Kalu continued, his voice cold and calculating. "And we'll launch a counteroffensive that will catch Odum off guard. We'll use every resource at our disposal, every tactic we've ever learned. This isn't just about winning anymore, it's about survival." The advisors nodded, though their expressions betrayed their unease. They knew that Kalu's plan was risky, bordering on desperate. But they also knew that he was a man who thrived on fear and control, and they had little choice but to follow his lead. As Kalu turned away from the table, his mind was already focused on the next steps. He would show Odum and the world that he was not a man to be underestimated. He would stop at nothing to reclaim his power, even if it meant plunging Nigeria into deeper chaos. Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. In Abuja, the days following the battle were filled with a mixture of cautious optimism and relentless preparation. Joshua Odum and his advisors worked tirelessly to solidify the gains, strengthen the defenses, and coordinate with their allies across the country. They knew that Kalu would not simply fade away, and that the final confrontation was still to come. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. The people of Abuja were beginning to rebuild their lives, the confidence bolstered by the victory. The city, though scarred by war, was slowly coming back to life. Joshua spent much of his time moving through the city, talking with soldiers, civilians, and local leaders. He listened to the concerns, offered reassurances, and shared in the small victories. It was important to him that the people knew he was not just a distant figurehead, but someone who understood the struggles and was committed to the future. One afternoon, as Joshua walked through a marketplace that had recently reopened, he was approached by an elderly man. The man's face was weathered and lined with age, but his eyes were sharp and full of determination. "Mr. President," the man said, bowing slightly, "I wanted to thank you. My family and I have lived in Abuja for generations, and we were ready to give up. But you and your soldiers saved us. You've given us hope again." Joshua shook the man's hand, humbled by his words. "Thank you, sir, but this victory belongs to all of us, to every soldier who fought, to every civilian who stood strong. We did this together, and together we'll rebuild our country." The man nodded, a smile breaking through his weathered features. "May the gods bless you, Mr. President. We're with you, no matter what comes next." Joshua watched as the man walked away, his heart swelling with a sense of purpose. This was why he fought, why he had taken on the mantle of leadership. It wasn't for power or glory, but for the people who looked to him for hope, for the future of a nation that had been torn apart by tyranny. As the days turned into weeks, Joshua and his advisors continued to prepare for the inevitable confrontation with Kalu. The reports coming in from the scouts and intelligence operatives indicated that Kalu was regrouping, amassing his remaining forces for a final, desperate push. It was clear that Kalu would not go down without a fight, and they needed to be ready. Adeora, who had been working tirelessly to coordinate with their allies and ensure the flow of supplies, approached Joshua one evening as he reviewed the latest intelligence reports. "Joshua," she said, her voice laced with concern, "our scouts have confirmed that Kalu is planning something big. He's pulling together every resource he has left, and it looks like he's preparing for a final assault." Joshua nodded, his expression grim. "We knew this was coming. Kalu's not the type to back down easily. He'll throw everything he has at us in one last attempt to take back what he's lost. We've bolstered our defenses, and our forces are in position," Adeora continued. "But we need to be ready for anything. Kalu's desperate, and desperate men do desperate things." Joshua agreed. "We need to keep our forces on high alert. We can't afford to be caught off guard. And we need to ensure that our allies are ready to move at a moment's notice." Adeora nodded, her eyes filled with resolve. "We're as ready as we can be, Joshua. Whatever Kalu throws at us, we'll face it together." Joshua looked at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her unwavering support. She had been by his side through every challenge, every battle, and he knew he couldn't have come this far without her. "We'll see this through, Adeora," Joshua said, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, we'll fight for Nigeria, for the people who believe in us. And we'll make sure that Kalu's tyranny ends once and for all." Adara placed her hand on Joshua's shoulder, her touch a reassuring presence. "We will, Joshua, we'll stand together, and we'll win." As the night settled over Abuja, the city remained on high alert, its defenders prepared for whatever might come. The battle for Nigeria's future was far from over, but Joshua Odum and his people were ready. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger for it. And when the final confrontation came, they would be ready to fight for the country, for the freedom, and for a future where Nigeria could once again be a land of hope and promise.